Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Shark Source podcast. I'm your host, Danny Parsons, and it has been a while since we have done an episode, and there's so much has happened in between. So, I never actually was able to make an episode covering the Erik Carlson trade, so I will give my thoughts on that, though it has become pretty much old news by now. I'll also be doing my full predictions for the 2018-19 season, and I'll be giving my thoughts on Jack Eichel becoming the captain of the Sabres, and finally on Seattle being pretty much confirmed to get an NHL team. So that's all next on the Shark Source podcast. So we are going to start by talking about the Erik Carlson trade. Now, there's a lot to say about it, but pretty much everything has been said. My thoughts on the trade are that it is a huge win for the Sharks. Most coverage I've seen is typical East Coast-centric, Canada-centric coverage that most hockey news receives. So all they did was focus on the Senators and how it was a huge loss for them, or how it was just a huge loss for their fans. They didn't really focus on the Sharks. So I'm going to be focusing on how this really benefits the Sharks. So the Sharks, I think even most Sens fans would agree that this was a robbery. The Sharks absolutely robbed the Senators for Carlson. The fact that they didn't give up Meyer or Hurdle as part of this deal and only give up one first-round pick, that's really a big win. The return that the Senators gave up for Duchesne was a better return than what they got for Carlson, without including Bobby Ryan's cap hit in this. So, a really big win for the Sharks, and I think this makes them a contender. And I'll talk a bit more about this in my predictions. I think this makes them a real cup contender. The lineup for tonight against the Ducks has been announced. He will be playing with Vlasic, which makes it a very good pairing. So I'm just excited to see that. I won't be able to watch the game tonight, but I will be able to watch highlights, and I'll have plenty of time to watch him throughout the season. So I'm very excited for that, and I think the Erik Carlson trade, it really caught me off guard. I didn't know Doug Wilson was even involved in talks for Carlson, but I'm very excited to see him play in teal. And that's about it for him. We're next going to go on to my predictions. Okay, so here are my full season NHL predictions for this year. I've been working on these predictions for a long time. I even made some preliminary early predictions over the summer, but now I can finally release my full predictions. And we are going to start with the Pacific Division, and winning the Pacific Division, and also winning the Western Conference for points in the regular season. I have the Sharks. I think they were already going to win the division before they got Carlson, just because a full season of them with Kane, with Burns hopefully playing back to his 2017 levels. I really think this team is going to do great things. Adding Carlson really elevates them from an elite team to the next tier of elite cup contenders for sure. So I think the Sharks are going to win this division, win the conference, and while I think there are other good teams in the division, I think it's going to be pretty clear for most of the season that the Sharks are going to win the division. It won't be much of a division race. That's my thoughts. So next, second place, I have Vegas. I don't think that it's going to be much competition for second either. I think Vegas is clearly the second best team in the Pacific Division. I know a lot of people have been saying they're going to regress, and I do think there might be a little regression. NHL Discussion had the audacity to rank them 10th, which I just thought was ridiculous. 10th in the NHL. No, I think they're going to be very good, and I think they're definitely going to be the Sharks' biggest competition in the Pacific Division. They have only gotten better with the acquisition of Paul Stastny and Max Pacioretty. While they did lose James Neal, I don't think that's going to affect them very much. So I really like Vegas, and I think they're going to do big things this season. Third place, I have Anaheim. Pretty much after San Jose and Vegas, this is where everyone else's opinions on the Pacific Division are all over the place. I've seen Anaheim as high as second, and I've seen them as low as seventh out of 8. So really, a lot of people have very different opinions about who's going where, and Anaheim is one of the more controversial teams. A lot of people saw how the Sharks really just took care of business in sweeping them in the playoffs and have decided that Anaheim has fallen off, but I don't think so just yet. Anaheim did get over 100 points last season, and I think it would be very difficult for them just to completely fall off the face of the earth after just one bad season, especially when they didn't really get any worse. I know Corey Perry is injured, but he wasn't a huge part of their team last year. He really had already his point production was not where it should have been. So I don't think that's going to affect them as much as a lot of Ducks haters hope it does. And I still think this team is a playoff team. I just don't think they're going to be as good. So I'm thinking they're a 90, low 90, maybe mid-high 90 team. Definitely not 100 points again. I do think they will be slightly worse, but still not as low as 7th like some people are rating them. In 4th place, here's where it gets interesting. I have Edmonton Oilers. A lot of people, I've seen them as low as 7th this year as well in some people's predictions. I think Edmonton is going to be a surprise team, and I think they are going to just barely miss the playoffs, and it's going to be pretty crushing for Oilers fans because they're going to come so close. But there will be improvement over last season. The Oilers' home penalty kill last season was the worst in NHL history by far, but their road penalty kill was pretty normal. It was not historically bad. I think their home penalty kill has to, even if they make no changes, it has to improve just because it's very rare an outlier like that remains an outlier season to season. So I think the Oilers are going to improve just based on that. And also, I think Cam Talbot should have a rebound year because their new backup goalie should be able to carry the load better than Al Montoya was able to. And I also do think they've just gotten slight improvements. So I do think they should do pretty well. One player I think you could watch is Kyler Yamamoto, if that's how you pronounce it. I think he should be an interesting up-and-coming player that Oilers fans will like. So obviously McDavid's going to have to lead the team, and this team will go only as far as he takes them. So I think they're going to need another MVP season out of him in order to do this well, but this is where I have him 4th in the Pacific Division. Next, and this is where a lot of people are going to be surprised, I have Arizona. Now, Arizona could go much higher than this, as high as 3rd, I think, and they could go much lower than this, as low as 8th, I think. Arizona is a mystery to me, really. We just have to decide, is this the Arizona of the early season that started like 0-7 or something, or is this the late season Arizona who is beating contenders like Tampa Bay when Arizona's season was pretty much over? So we don't know what's going to happen with Arizona. I think they'll fall around 5th. I think Antti Raanta will have to play very well for them. Clayton Keller will have to have another good season. And I think this team is about 1 or 2 years away from being a playoff team. In 6th, I have the LA Kings. Now, this is a prediction that could really backfire on me, and this is one that I'm less confident about. The Kings are a very good team, but I just don't see them finishing ahead of Edmonton or Arizona, though they easily could. The reason I think that is that I think Jonathan Quick has really been masking a lot of this team's flaws. As you saw in the series against Vegas, there was absolutely no reason the Kings should not have won that series, because any team really with Quick playing that well should have won. And if you remember, at the start of last season, LA was very hot right out the gate, and they could do that again, but I just don't think that team is deep enough. Besides their first and second line, I don't think they have the depth to really contend for the playoffs. So this is a pick that I didn't necessarily think they were bad, but I don't think they're good enough to be a top 4 team in the division, and I have them at 6th. Now at 7th, here comes probably one of my most controversial picks. I have Calgary finishing 7th in the division. A lot of people, I've seen them winning the division. I've seen people picking them second quite frequently. I think they're going to finish 7th in the division. The reason is they've done nothing to solve their goaltending problem. Now, if Smith stays healthy like he did last year, one might say that they'll be good again, because when Smith was healthy last season, they were a good team. But I do not believe that Mike Smith, even when healthy, can lead this team to the playoffs. And this team has shown that without goaltending, they have no chance at winning. Once Smith went down, this team tanked last season. And I think even with Smith up, they will have a hard time making the playoffs. I also think that the loss of Dougie Hamilton is going to hurt the team. While I do like Noah Hannafin and I think he's a good player, that was a bad trade, and I think that is going to hurt them. And in last place, in the Pacific Division and in the Western Conference, I have Vancouver. Now, Canucks fans should be excited about this team. They are doing a nice rebuild. Brock Besser is looking good. Bo Horvat's looking good. And maybe Thatcher Demko will play this year and actually play well. That's probably the most interesting player, in my opinion, in their organization. They have very high hopes for the goaltending prospect Thatcher Demko, but it seems like they've had high hopes for him for a while, and he still hasn't really done anything in the NHL. I don't think Markstrom has panned out. He's been a highly touted prospect for a while now. It seems like what we've seen is what he is. He's not an elite goalie. He's a mediocre starter, and he should really be a backup in this league. But, they're going to have to find a way to win with him if they want to surprise everyone and make the playoffs. But I don't think they will. I think they're going to be just tanking this year, especially since Quinn Hughes will not be playing on them. He's going to play at the University of Michigan this year. And I think there's a good chance that we could see Jack and Quinn Hughes, the two American brothers, lead the Canucks to a cup, because it's a good chance that Jack Hughes, the number 1 overall pick, ends up with the Canucks, since they are going to have a really bad record. And even if they do eventually win the cup with this core, it's going to be a while. I think their rebuild is a lot further back than, say, Buffalo's rebuild. So that's it for the Pacific Division. Now on to the Central. And in first place in the Central, I have the Nashville Predators. Don't let the complete choke job in last year's playoffs fool you. This team is still very good. They still have all their core pretty much. They've got Turris. A full season of him should be very exciting for them. And most importantly, I think Ryan Johansson, who they signed for a huge contract after the 2017 Cup run, and then he really disappointed. I think he is going to return to form, and the Predators are going to have a great year. I really can't think of much bad things to say about them, except that I don't like Pecorine. He's choked in the playoffs for 3 straight seasons, and they need to figure something out. If he plays like he did in the regular season, well, then they better hope he continues that in the playoffs, because we've seen nothing to suggest that he won't choke in the playoffs. And as for UC Saros, he's probably the Aaron Dell of the Predators, a very overrated goalie, and I don't think he'll be able to lead them to a cup either. I think that really his stats have been inflated by the fact that he has a great defense and usually plays when it's bad teams. I don't think he's a very good goalie. But despite this question marks in goal, I still think Nashville's going to win the Central Division, which is the toughest division in hockey. Second place, I have the Jets. I think this team is probably the most overrated team in the NHL. And the only reason I say that is because there are people like NHL Discussion on Instagram and Twitter who are rating them second best in the NHL. And I don't even think they're a top 5 team. Now, there's nothing wrong with the Jets. I think they're a good team. I just don't think they're that good. I do have them finishing second in the division, and that's only because they are so deep. This team has such a deep forward core, and they're really strong on defense too. A lot of people say their defense isn't so strong, but I actually do think they have a good defense. The biggest question mark for them is Connor Hellebuyck. He had a career year last season, but that is the only time he's played that well. He's still not necessarily a proven elite goaltender. So we have to find out, can he play like that every year, or was he a one-year wonder? We'll have to see. But I do have them finishing second in the division. In third place, I have St. Louis. This team is not as bad as they played last year. Don't be fooled. This team missed the playoffs by 1 point last season with injuries and with Jake Allen playing terribly. I think getting Carter Hutton out of St. Louis was exactly what they needed, because it seems like Jake Allen can't play well when there's another goalie looking to take his spot. You saw that when Brian Elliott was playing there too. And Carter Hutton almost took Jake Allen's spot in goal. But I think Jake Allen, now that he is the undisputed starter in St. Louis, I think he is going to play very well. And I think he will play just like he did in that series against Minnesota 2017, where he really robbed the Wild of doing well in the playoffs. So I think Jake Allen will be the key to their success. Tarasenko, I think, is going to have another great year. The addition of Ryan O'Reilly, I loved. And I think St. Louis will finish third in this division. And I think they're going to do damage in the playoffs. We'll get to that later. In fourth place, I have the Minnesota Wild. This team ran into injury problems when they played the Jets in round 1. That series did not go 5 games because the Wild are a bad team. It went 5 games because the Jets were very hot at the time and because the Wild were missing so many players. Make no mistake, this team will not go from their great season last year to the bottom of the division. I've seen a lot of predictions where Minnesota does not make the playoffs and even where they finish last in the division, but I think the Wild are a lot better than what most people think. Devin Dubnyk will need to lead the way for this team to make it into the playoffs, as he has done in years past. Eric Stahl will have to continue his remarkable rebirth that we saw last season. Zach Parise will have to play well, and I think younger players like Charlie Coyle and Matt Dumba will also have to contribute. And in fifth place in the second wild card, Minnesota was the first wild card. In the second wild card, I have the Dallas Stars. Dallas, like Minnesota, had a lot of injury problems. The Stars ran into injury problems just before the playoffs. They were going on a push to make it, and then their goalie, Ben Bishop, went down with an injury, and that was pretty much it. If they can stay healthy, I think this team is a playoff team. They just locked up Tyler Seguin in a great move. Third overall pick, Miro Heiskanen, will be making his debut. He played in Europe 1 year after he was drafted to develop, but now he will be in the NHL, and I think he will make an impact for the Stars, and I think they are going to barely make the playoffs. In sixth place in the Central, and missing the playoffs, I have the Colorado Avalanche. They were a fan favorite last year, even from non-Avalanche fans, because they went from by far last in the NHL to back to relevancy and in the playoffs. And I think they are going to contend for the playoffs right until the end of the season. The only reason I think they're going to miss is because the division is so tough. This team is a good team, and they're young and fast and exciting to watch. I just don't think they are deep enough to make the playoffs. I'm pulled up their line combinations. Their top line is one of the best top lines in the NHL. We've got Gabe Landeskog, Hart Trophy nominee Nathan MacKinnon, and Mikko Rantanen. That's a great top line. But their second line looks like a lot of teams' third line. Alex Kerfoot, Tyson Jost, and Sven Andrighetto. And their third line, Vladislav Kamenev, JT Compher, and Colin Wilson. A lot of people might not have even heard of them. And former Shark Matt Nieto, Carl Soderberg, and Matt Calvert is their fourth line. I just don't think they're a deep enough team to make the playoffs. This team is still young, and there's still plenty of time to win with this core. I think they got a huge upgrade in goal when they got Philip Grubauer from the Capitals, and I think they're going to contend, but I just don't think they're deep enough up front or on the back end. Finally, finishing last in the division, I have the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, a lot of people are very eager to have the Blackhawks finish last because they are sick of the Blackhawks always beating their teams. I do think that the main reason the Blackhawks missed the playoffs last season was because Corey Crawford was injured. However, I still don't think they'll make it, even with him back, because I just don't think they're deep enough, similarly to the Avalanche. If we look at their line combinations, after their first and second lines, it really starts getting weak. I think that Panarin trade was a huge punch in the gut, and I also think on defense they're going to struggle immensely. Duncan Keith and Brett Seabrook have not looked like themselves lately, and with Crawford coming back from an injury, the last thing he needs is a weak defense. So while I still think this team will improve from last season because Crawford's back, I don't think they will finish any higher than 7th. Now for the Eastern Conference, and we're going to start in the Atlantic Division. In first place in the Atlantic and winning the President's Trophy, I have the Tampa Bay Lightning. I can't find a single thing about the Tampa Bay Lightning I don't like. They are without question the deepest team in the entire NHL. Their forward core and their defensive core are the strongest in the league. One example of how deep they are is the fact that they can comfortably play Kucherov and Stamkos together without needing to worry about spreading the wealth, because Braden Point, Andre Palat, and Yanni Gourde are on their second line, which is a very solid second line. On defense, they got Victor Hedman, Ryan McDonagh, and Mikhail Sergachev, each playing on their own defensive pairing. Anton Stralman with Ryan McDonagh is a great defensive pairing. And Victor Hedman has made Dan Girardi look like a legit NHL defenseman. Andrei Vasilevsky proved me wrong and has remained one of the best goalies in the NHL. For a long time, I was saying they should stick with Bishop, but it seems like Vasilevsky has done the trick. They don't really have a good backup right now. It seems like Louis Domingue will be a good backup goalie. If I were the Lightning GM, I would go out and I'd call the Sharks and try and acquire Bebo, since we have him stuck in the minors, even though he's a legit NHL backup. For Tampa Bay, it's cup or bust. There's no way they should not win a cup with this good of a team, and anything other than that would be a failure. In second place, I have the Florida Panthers. The Panthers are going to be a surprise team. A lot of people have been underestimating them because they play in the Sun Belt, because they're not a big market, and they've been one of the worst franchises to ever play in the NHL, least successful. But this season, it's going to be a breakout year for the Cats. If you saw how they played down the stretch last season, they barely missed the playoffs, but they were red hot, and I think they will continue that into this season. They've had injury problems, and that's pretty much been the reason why they've been unable to make the playoffs since 2016. But if they can stay healthy, which I think they will make the playoffs. Luongo is still looking good when he's healthy. Reimer is not a suitable backup, so Luongo will have to carry the load for the team. But I think he can and will, and I think this team will finish second in the Atlantic Division. In third place, barely, this was a very tough decision, I have Toronto. This team is probably the most overrated team in the Eastern Conference. I've seen them ranked as high as 5th in the NHL. I've seen people rank them 1st in the division. I've seen people list them as cup contenders. This team is very mediocre. They have one of the best offenses in the league, no question. But when it comes to defense, it's Morgan Riley and nobody. Gardner is pretty overrated. He can score 50 points sometimes, but he's no good on defense, and I think that's really going to hurt them. Nylander is still holding out and will not play tonight against Montreal. I don't know how they're going to solve that, and when they do, I don't know how they're going to solve Matthews and Marner holding out next season, which I think is almost certain at this point. They're in a lot of trouble, and the issue at defense is going to take a lot to fix. I also think that it's not being stated enough that the loss of JVR and Bozak is really going to hurt their offense, which I still think is good enough to carry them to 3rd place, but I don't think it's good enough for them to do anything in the playoffs. In 4th place in the division, I have Boston. I have them finishing just slightly below Toronto. The only reason that I have them finishing lower than Toronto is I don't think they are deep enough to really be an elite team in their division. They have that first line, which is one of the best first lines in the league. But other than that, nothing on them really seems elite yet. I do think they have a lot of good young players, and I do think they will continue to be successful for the foreseeable future, but I don't think they're a top 3 team in this division. And I think there's going to be significant regression from their amazing season last season. In 5th place, I have Buffalo. Now, Buffalo is going to lose a lot of offense with the loss of Ryan O'Reilly, but the addition of Dahlin, Eichel being healthy, Sobotka, Tage Thompson, they got a lot of new young guys, and they finally got rid of Leonard, which is long overdue. I think Buffalo will do well mostly because of the weak division. I love the addition of Skinner. I don't think they're a playoff team unlike Boston, who will make a wild card spot, but I do think that there will be a lot of hope for Sabres fans after the terrible season last season. In 6th place in the Atlantic Division, I have Montreal. This team is very bad, one of the worst in the NHL. In 6th place in the Atlantic Division, I have the Montreal Canadiens. The Habs are bad. They are very bad. I think they are one of the worst teams in the entire NHL. The only reason I have them finishing 6th out of 8 teams in the Atlantic Division is because of Carey Price. I think he will single-handedly win them multiple games, enough games so that they will finish ahead of Detroit and Ottawa, but not nearly enough games for them to make the playoff. And if you're a Canadiens fan, I think you have to be furious at ownership for letting Marc Bergevin run this team into the ground. In 6th place, I have Detroit. Detroit is also, like Montreal, not a good team. They're in a pretty bad cap situation, despite not really having any good players. They lost Zetterberg to back injury. He's going to retire. The only bright spot on this team really are a few young players like Dylan Larkin and goaltender Jimmy Howard. I think Jimmy Howard, who has struggled with injuries, will be one of the best players on this team. And he is the only reason that I have them finishing 2nd last in the division and not last. In last place in the division, I have the Ottawa Senators. This team is a dumpster fire. There's really not a lot that can be said about them that is good. Mark Stone is pretty much one of the only players who can produce now. Matt Duchene is probably their best player, but he will be traded mid-season, and they don't have their first-round pick this year. If you're a Sens fan, there's not really a lot to look forward to. Brady Tkachuk should be good, and I think it'll be interesting to watch him. But if I was a Sens fan, I would be furious at ownership, and I would not have a lot of hope for the future. In 1st place in the Metropolitan Division, I have the defending Stanley Cup champion, Washington Capitals. The Capitals did not lose any players of note other than Philip Grubauer over the offseason. They totally overpaid for Tom Wilson, but he will be out 20 games. That suspension was announced as I am recording the podcast. So they're going to have a little bit of struggles offensively, as Wilson did produce offensively as well as act as an enforcer. But I still think this team is very good. I think they're cup contenders yet again, and I think they're going to walk away with this division. In second place, I have the Pittsburgh Penguins. Their core is still intact. They still have a very deep forward core. Their defense is still pretty good, and Murray is still a solid goaltender. There's no reason they should finish any lower than second in the division. Now, if you're a Penguins fan, you have to be upset at the GM, because while hindsight is 2020, it seems like keeping Murray and losing Fleury was the wrong decision. Is Murray younger? Yes. Is Murray cheaper? Yes. Is Murray controllable for longer? Yes. But Fleury is the better goalie. If they had Fleury, I think there's a very good chance that they would have won their third straight Stanley Cup. In third place, I have the Columbus Blue Jackets. They very nearly knocked off the Washington Capitals last season. They were up 2-0. I think they will improve. I think the only problem with this team is the Panarin situation. He has requested a trade. It seems like the Blue Jackets have decided to keep him for the season and try and contend. I don't know what happens this offseason, but I know that will probably affect the locker room with all his teammates knowing he wants out. In fourth place and taking the second wild card spot in the East after Boston, I have the Carolina Hurricanes. Despite Darling being injured, despite some questionable moves this offseason, I think the Hurricanes will be a playoff team. I think they're too deep to not be a playoff team, especially on the back end. And I think they're going to surprise a lot of people who have sort of stopped believing in them after they've been the trendy pick for years. They're sort of the non-trendy pick this year, and I'm picking them to barely make the playoffs. In fifth place in the Metropolitan Division, I have Philadelphia. I have them barely missing the playoffs. The only thing I don't like about the Flyers is their goaltending. I don't think they did anything in the offseason to solve it. I know they're hoping that Alex Lyon comes up and becomes the goaltender of the future. I don't see it happening. And without a goalie, I don't think they can make the playoffs. In sixth place, I have the New Jersey Devils. I don't think they're a bad team. I just think that they're not going to make the playoffs because they didn't do anything to improve, while the rest of the division will improve, and I think they're going to finish sixth. I think Taylor Hall will come back down to earth. He'll still be a superstar, but I don't think he'll have a Hart Trophy season next year. Nico Hischier will need to step up for this team in order for them to make the playoffs, and hopefully for them, Corey Schneider will stay healthy and be able to lead them to the playoffs, but I don't see it happening. I have them finishing sixth. Finishing seventh, I have the New York Rangers. They've committed to a rebuild, they've said it's a rebuild, and they are doing it right. I love the prospects they have, and I think they could be contenders again while Lundqvist is still in the NHL. He will be far past his prime by then, but at least he will still be a player. I think they are doing their rebuild in the right way, and I think they will be contenders again sooner than most people think, but not this. In last place in the Metropolitan Division and in the Eastern Conference, I have the New York Islanders. They improved at coach, they improved at goaltender, but they lost John Tavares, and he really was the heart and soul of that team. Now, if they kept the team as it is right now, I think they'd probably finish around 6th or even 5th, but I think they're going to trade Eberle, trade maybe Anders Lee. They're going to tear it down because they have been sort of in semi-rebuild, retool, semi-contention mode for a while. I think they'll fully commit to the rebuild, and I think they'll have a better future to come now that Garth Snow is gone. And that is it for my regular season predictions. I have playoff predictions as well. I'm just going to read off my Cup final predictions because I don't have time to read the others. So in my Cup final, I have Tampa Bay versus San Jose, and I have Tampa Bay winning the Cup 4-2. You heard it here first. Tampa Bay is going to win the Stanley Cup. I know they're a very popular pick to win the Stanley Cup, and they should be because they're one of the best teams, if not the best team in the NHL. I think they're the best team in the NHL. I think they will win the Cup. And that is it for the podcast. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to check out the Instagram page for news about the Sharks. The opening night is tonight. They play the Ducks. Hopefully they can get the dub. And I will see everyone at the next episode.